The European Union has prepared the REPower EU plan to reduce dependence on Russian energy. Accelerating the renewable energy transformation is among the targets. Of course, that's encouraging news. But what are the main challenges that the EU may face in the transition to renewables?
First thing, I think we have to, if Europe can have any chance of solving its energy security problems, we have to remember that its energy security challenges did not begin with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, for 2 winters in a row, they've had very high prices and shortages of gas. And if you studied what happened in those 2 winters, you realize when Europe doesn't have enough gas, it doesn't use more renewables, it actually uses more coal and fuel oil. So, which of course is bad for air pollution and also bad in terms of the numbers of emissions. So if you're very radical on natural gas and you don't provide for enough natural gas in Europe, you don't end up with more renewables, you end up with more coal. And we have to understand that this wasn't, this didn't start with Russia, with the invasion, but this was also an intended policy of the EU, which was to not commission more gas into Europe in order to make more room for renewables, which in the end created this more room for coal. So I think we need to ask ourselves, when did Europe, the United States, most Western governments get so negative on natural gas? Because it has almost zero impact on air pollution and has much lower emissions than any other competing fuels. And just like even the fact that energy security is such a, it affects everything, the economy, national security, manufacturing sectors. We can't even have a panel here on energy security without it really being a panel about climate. But you don't do the same if you have a panel on food security. You don't say, wait, well, what about the climate aspect? Or a panel on transportation. You say, well, what about the climate aspect, right? Why is energy, why has natural gas been so targeted? Why is energy such a, energy security so inconsequential that, that we would really think about suppressing demand for natural gas?
Mm-hmm. Zarour, in the World Energy Outlook 2020 report published by the International Energy Agency, the Russia-Ukraine war and the effects of this war on energy prices and access to energy resources are among the issues that draw attention. If this war continues to drag on for months, possibly even years, what awaits us in the future of the energy market?
Oh, it's a very good question, actually. So we see it's from 2 perspectives. Yeah, one and the most important is that we should continue to monitor the market. That's for sure. We know that what Brenda has said and what we are building, I'm building on that, the clean energy investment budgets has skyrocketed this year for $140 billion already. But again, from the report that you have just mentioned of the International Energy Agency, we see that it's not enough. We see that if we want to keep on with 2050 net zero emission target, the planned investment of 1.5 trillion is not enough. We are talking about maybe $3–4 trillion, which are still needed to have this move. So having that without keeping the existing growth is not possible as well. So what the world needs to do is to have the balanced approach, of course, because during the pandemic years and the pre-pandemic years, there was a significant underinvestment in the existing assets. For minimum for $1 trillion, that's what the people are talking about. So first of all, we need to divide everything into the mid, short, and long-term targets. We need to make sure that on short term we have enough resources to run our economies. And in mid-term, we need to make sure that we can make this transition. And the long term, we need to do this transition because I think what's written about the climate, what's written about the targets, what's written about the trying to keep by 2035 the world within this famous 1.5 degree up is not working. So we need really to have a segregated approach, stepped approach, and we need to allocate the financial resources to make sure that this is happening.
Mm-hmm. Karim, do you see the problems that we're seeing now related to energy insecurity as a promising opportunity for the transition to renewable energy sources? And these short, mid, and long-term steps that Zaur talked about, what can be done to capitalize on this opportunity?
So in the short term, it's quite tight. It was already tight to start with, as Brenda has pointed out. The investment being less and less, especially in the EU. Just so everyone understands, in order to meet our climate goals of limiting climate change or global warming to 1.5 degrees, as we need to do, to avoid dangerous climate change. We already have climate change, but dangerous climate change. Europe has committed in an international treaty known as the Paris Agreement to limiting its emissions in half by 55% by the end of this decade and to reach net zero carbon by 2050. So this is a legal obligation that the EU has to meet. Now, the EU finds itself a little bit in a tight spot. It has already reduced its dependence on gas, I think as Brenda has pointed out, and tried to limit the investments into what a lot of climate folk call carbon bombs. Once you invest in a new gas facility in the extraction side or on the LNG side, you kind of need to get your money back in 20, 25 years. So many avoid doing that for the fear that this might be a stranded asset on the investor side, but also on the policy side, there's a tendency to discourage this kind of behavior, especially in Europe. So what happened with the Ukraine war is this just exacerbated the situation significantly further, and now we have the energy landscape that we ended up with. In the short term, this is certainly a problem. I mean, we potentially won't have enough energy for our needs this winter in Europe. Obviously, this is not the same problem elsewhere around the world, but certainly a Europe-centric issue. It has ramifications around the world, but it's primarily a European crisis. But in the long term, what we had seen is the EU double down on its climate targets. Says, well, our goal for 45% renewables, let's make that 45%. And our goal for phasing down natural gas, we're definitely doing that. 30% less by end of this decade and 80% by mid-century. In other words, and Europe's already 25% down already year on year in terms of natural gas consumption. So basically, since the Ukraine war, natural gas production has gone down, obviously with economic consequences, needless to say. So the question here is, how can Europe manage the need for energy today, for which there's very little spare capacity. There's no gas lying around. Europe, North America, the Gulf producers have provided everything they can short of major investments. But the East Med, a region like the East Med has really struggled because that requires major investment and no one's willing to give them money to do that because of the fear of having stranded assets in terms of pipeline or LNG facilities, etc. So that need to get gas today to Europe, but not tomorrow, is a real conundrum because everyone wants to invest in something that they'll get their money back in 25 years. 25 years is 2050-ish, at which point Europe is saying 80% less gas. So you've got a consumer here who says, we don't want that gas. Don't build a facility. We won't buy it in 25 years, but we want gas today. And desperately, we want gas today. It's a real conundrum, I think for the producers. Some would say it's a mixed policy signal, but on the climate front, if we can get past a few difficult winters, that could stimulate faster energy transition to renewables. This short period is going to be really tight. It's going to be really difficult. It will have economic ramifications on the European economy and might lead to some businesses. We've already seen since the IRA, what's the formal name for the IRA?
You don't remember it because it's called Inflation Reduction Act, but
yes.
Since it's $780 billion, it's actually Inflation Creation Act. But
it's the creative name, I think, is what I was missing. So the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is also another trigger for a lot of renewable energy investments and other investments moving to North America from Europe.
But if we get past that, that means Europe will accelerate its move towards renewable energy, accelerate its move away from coal and natural gas into renewables. That's the ideal scenario. So short-term pain, perhaps long-term gain.
Do you think the world can reach a global consensus on turning crises into opportunity, or is it even necessary for there to be a global consensus on the issue of energy?
We're not very good at this, are we? Turning crises into opportunities. You could argue that Europe is trying to do that by doubling down and saying we're definitely not giving up on our climate goals. I think Turkey does that sometimes when it tries to get around its lack of natural fossil fuels in its own territory. It normally refers to that as energy independence rather than climate, but it ultimately means that Turkey now consumes 50% of its electricity from renewable energy sources, which has done quite quietly. It didn't make too much noise about that, perhaps because of the rhetoric it uses, tends to focus independence rather than carbon emissions. So it can sometimes happen, but can the world reach consensus on this? I very much doubt that. I don't think we've reached consensus on much simpler issues.
Brenda, the war in Ukraine has proved how challenging the weaponization of energy can be as a response to a large-scale Western sanctions imposed on Russia. Although European countries are trying to deprive Russia of its energy exports, China has proven itself to be a lifeline for Russia. What are the effects that you see on the energy crisis of the expanded Sino-Russia energy cooperation?
Right. So first thing, in light of the war, we have to be thinking that energy infrastructure, critical energy infrastructure, is going to be targeted for disruption much more in the future. I mean, that we already see this the last decade with a lot of cyber attacks, but I think with the attack on Nord Stream 2, with the attack on Ukraine's electricity infrastructure, I think the normalization of attacks on energy infrastructure is going to be a lot bigger. We could say, in general, the West's energy policies really benefit China. So if we could say that, for instance, the sanctions policies, and this doesn't mean I'm against the sanctions, but you have to look at the consequences. The sanctions policies mean that China buys cheaper oil, about 30% cheaper than the West buys. So the base of fuel of your economy is cheaper for the West's main rival, which is China. Going from a fossil fuel-based economy where basically the US leads to one based on electricity where China leads for all the critical materials is a huge geopolitical shift. It's a huge economic shift. The climate agreements, and you asked if there's international consensus, basically it sets us up for a system where the US and the West try to transition into renewable energy, but China and India continue to produce emissions. And even by their own, even if they go by their own declarations and to the Paris Agreement, China will peak in 2030. So if you understand that language, that means that China can, roar ahead with emissions up to 2030 and then peak. So what does that mean? At some point it could start to come down. India committed to net zero to 2070, right? So essentially the US and Europe can actually stop all their emissions, and it'll be meaningless if China and India can continue to roar. And I could say another system that actually advantages China is our public finance. So the West has stopped, all public finance for fossil fuels, including natural gas, which is a clean fuel. And so who's picking up the slack, especially in the African nations, because they want what they call, what I heard in a recent visit of mine to Africa, we want real energy, which means energy that's reliable, that's not volatile. If you want real energy, so who's picking up the slack for the public finance? That's China, and with all that goes with it. So our policies on energy and climate are definitely empowering China. And it's not clear that we get much out of the bargain. This is just a geopolitical effect.
Mm-hmm. Karim, I want to ask you this next question because I want to stick with China for a moment, because it was at this year's COP27 that there was this benchmark decision for climate justice to establish a loss and damage compensation mechanism. But it's complicated because the main discussion centered around the distinction between developed and developing countries. Now, China, we know, is a huge emitter of carbon, but it's also still classified as a developing country. So can the loss and damage compensation aspect actually be realized?
Okay, so these are two separate issues. So the categorization of countries into developing, emerging, and developed happened about 30 years ago when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed after the Earth Summit in 1992. So quite a long way back. And some countries ended up in different groups. Turkey, for example, is an emerging economy, which means it cannot get climate finance. China is a developing economy, which means it can get climate finance, which is bizarre, but 30 years ago, the world was a different place. Now, there are certainly people asking to revise the system, and now that it has another real consequences in terms of climate finance on different countries, and the system doesn't seem to be fit for purpose anyways, and we have moved on. Like, we have the Paris Agreement where everyone is in, there's no categorization anymore, everyone is supposed to produce their nationally determined contributions and work according to that in a voluntary way. And we're moving on to action anyway, so there's nothing to negotiate as such. This is, the climate world is now driven by the need for climate action. What has happened is that we had seen the discussions on loss and damage accelerate really fast since Glasgow. There was major demands by developing economies, Africa and Asia, in the run-up to COP27, saying we need to add this on the agenda. The US said no. Europe said no. It wasn't on the agenda. First day of COP, somehow it magically made its way into the agenda. Shuttle diplomacy, it was back and forth between different camps. Somehow it managed to get its way on the agenda on the first day, and somehow by magic, 2 weeks later, there was a consensus on pretty void kind of agreement. Like, we will do something about this issue. We recognize the need to do something. We'll work out the details later, more or less. But the scope, that one thing that they did agree on, partly because of pushback by the US and the European Union, was that the money will not be distributed to developing economies, because that includes China. It will be distributed to the most vulnerable countries through climate change, and the most at risk from loss and damage, and that require loss and damage compensation. But loss and damage compensation is basically compensation for things that cannot be adapted to, climate change impacts that we cannot adapt to and are certainly locked in, and for which we need to compensate the countries by those who have committed the most to that. And to come back to Brenda's point on the US, the West versus China, so far all the carbon in the atmosphere today, the additional carbon, not the carbon that was naturally there, most of it is attributed to European and North American economies. So the issue here is, yes, China now is responsible for about 30%. If you add all the historical emissions, you'll find that the West is responsible for most of it. So just to argue that if we stop all our emissions, China moves ahead, this is all in vain, it's actually not in vain. We kind of probably will avoid 2.5-degree warming and maybe get 2-degree warming, which is still pretty good. It's less disastrous, less runaway climate change, more risk of this happening to us. But of course, it gives an advantage to an economy that becomes more carbon intensive, that doesn't have any carbon taxes, so to speak, on its own economy. But baked into the climate governance system, the COP meetings, the UNFCCC, is this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, equities, and respective capabilities. In other words, we're not all the same in this. We're all working together, but we're not equally responsible for this. And we know who is most responsible, and they have to do more. So there is already baked into the system kind of moral liability on Western countries to do more and to demonstrate responsibility. What was also baked into it, that those countries also need to provide finance, need to help with technical capabilities on adaptation, and do something on loss and damage. So yes, in making up for this, the West somehow has committed through the UNFCCC process to make up for what they have done. Yes, it will give an advantage to the developing economies today to move faster. But isn't it in their right to develop in the first place? Like, why are we punishing them for not developing? The system, the climate governance system that we have created, gives them the right to develop. These are the rules that we're working with. And yes, it will mean that the West will become worse off, geopolitically speaking.
Brenda, did you want to add something?
So your moral crafted argument ends with, but it's okay that the West will be weaker and China will be stronger, and that's morally okay to you?
No, it's not morally crafted. It's saying that the system that we have crafted in terms of climate governance argues that those countries are allowed to develop economically. And they're allowed to get to more or less the same level of income, GDP per capita that the West currently enjoys. And if they don't do that, then it's unfair to them. Then why would we stifle their economic growth because we have had the right to put all that emissions into the atmosphere in the first place? This is kind of where it goes. The geopolitical side of it wasn't baked into the system, but it might be a consequence. But what is definitely in the system is the economic growth, the right of developing economies to grow, despite the need to cut carbon emissions.
Certainly a great debate topic. Zohar, I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier, where you said there needs to be a balanced approach to reach net zero targets. What are the steps that countries and companies you think should take on clean energy?
If we talk about the dimensions, it's definitely what we are doing in SOCAR as well. So we should talk about decarbonization, circular economy, and probably the green finance. We started to talk about it a bit outside. I think these are the major steps which the most of the counterparts, at least in our sector, are doing today. We in SOCAR definitely are moving in this direction as well. So we have been working closely with the financial institutions towards issuing our first green bonds. We are very close to that. We, particularly, for example, in SOCAR, Turkey are doing a great moves towards the decarbonization. It includes a lot of a series of events, not only on the physical planning of the new assets that we have done. For example, our Star refinery, which is one of the newest refineries in the region and one of the biggest investments in Turkey. It's very difficult to say that for the oil refinery, but we did it in the most ecological way. Starting from the planning stage. We invested quite a lot of money in our petrochemical facilities, in our research and development unit, and we are today enjoying the close cooperation with the European Union, for example. We are with its carbon emission unit, where we got 2 grants already from the EU towards bringing the new bioplastics and biofuels in the market. So we are doing that. We are spending a lot of money for our R&D department on that. We are spending quite a lot of money in the digital transformation also, because in a lot of cases human cannot just take certain actions which the computers or automated process can, which in its end helps us to decrease the total commitment, total carbon commitment. I had certain figures which I can't find now, but we see that from all those acts which we have done during the past years, we saved quite extensively on electricity consumption, on water consumption, on steam consumption. So everything, all those actions, they have a certain digits, certain figures behind, which helps, of course, the environment. One last thing, of course, is the work between the state and the companies. I think this is very important. I think all states have to have the clear program for their countries in accordance with the Paris Agreement. We don't see that extensively. So the agreements are done, the global agreements are there. We have been on COP as well. We see that there is a good initiatives which are put. First of all, I think the COP is a very right forum to discuss and how to put this global agenda into the actions. That's the most important, because we as a companies are taking our actions in accordance with these outcomes. For example, this year there was a lot of discussion about offshore wind. We are strong believers in that. In Azerbaijan, we have a huge potential for it as well. But this is something new, something take away, let's put it this way, which we'll work on. But the clear agenda is very important. I think we are in Turkey, we are working closely with the ministries of energy, of ecology and climate change. We have now the Minister of Ecology and Climate Change. So I think this is also the first step towards bringing it high in our agenda. And of course, we need to, it's not, whatever the one company is doing is not enough. I mean, it should be a joint effort of the companies, of the state, and it has to be planned. It should not be just, we do that and you do that, and let's see what happens here.
Brenda, the COP27 implementation plan states that about $4 trillion a year needs to be invested in renewable energy until 2030. I mean, that sounds just like an enormous, mind-boggling amount of money. Do current financial structures have the potential to support that?
Right. So first thing we have to, in talking about the prices, we have to talk about how we deliver renewable energy actually to homes and businesses, right? So how do most of you access renewable energy, the current generation of renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar, hydropower, geothermal, is through electricity. How does electricity work? It works on what's essential to a system is what's called a base load. It needs one stable source of energy that doesn't have the volatility of, let's say, wind or solar, and that can constantly keep the energy system, the electricity system stable, because it's very volatile itself. Electricity, as you know, even in your homes, when you make some sort of, you ramp it up or you use less, and suddenly your whole electricity system falls at home, right? So when we use renewables, it's not like when you hear these numbers that we can get to 90%, 80% renewables, even if we, for a certain day or a certain hour, you use 90% renewables, it's built on the fact that 50% of the demand is actually being supplied by gas, nuclear, coal, by something else. So first thing, we need to factor into these numbers and into our energy security policies that renewables don't replace current generation. Maybe in the future there'll be some, obviously in the future there'll be something different, but current generation doesn't replace the need for fossil fuels or nuclear. It goes hand in hand. And in fact, in the past, up until maybe 10 years ago, all renewable projects were designed together with generally a natural gas project. So we need to factor in not just the number that we need for renewables, but actually what we need to attain these baseload fuels. And that's, really probably double the number. And also, in terms of our energy security policies, again, our policymakers are constantly talking about if we could up the amount of renewables, we won't have any more needs for natural gas, we won't have any more needs for nuclear, and it's really not how these systems work. I think policymakers in most countries, especially in Europe and the United States, they're really talking about that's not the way these energy systems work, and they're giving us a sort of an incorrect picture of how you deliver renewable energy actually to homes and businesses.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to make sure you all get a chance to get in a last word. So Brenda, is there anything else you want to briefly add?
I think that also we need to talk about, again, with the issue of price, that in Europe's current crisis, it's not enough for energy to replace energy. Europe probably will weather this winter in terms of the number of molecules, but the question is at what price that it's received the new energy, and especially through LNG. And this will contribute to the destruction of a lot of industries, a lot of jobs in Europe. As we've seen with COVID, when you lose businesses, sometimes they don't come back. It will be quite disastrous for Europe, and we might even see, we had a very big drop in the oil price this week, when actually oil should have gone up because of the Russia cap in Russia going in place. I think we should watch what happens with the oil price, because it might be an indicator of a much bigger financial trend, that you might feel happy that the oil price is going down, but sometimes it's an indicator of economic collapse, and so we need to take a look at it. And I think also we're sitting here in Turkey. I think there are a lot of lessons from Turkey itself, because while everyone's in crisis in energy markets, Turkey proved by having actually, not just letting market forces do it, but having the government really involved over the years in energy security. You have here a diversified market with 6 different gas sources coming into the market, a fuel mix that's diversified, that's not dependent, on one source or the other. You have mostly pipeline gas, which is much cheaper than LNG, so you're not as Turkey isn't as vulnerable to these volatility in LNG, where global gas prices. So I think, basically Turkey can say, yeah, they're doing a good job, and Europe, I think, can learn a lot from Turkey in this respect.
All right. Zaur, did you have something to add quickly?
I just add one thing, that the era of the high oil prices, the energy companies are all blamed for it. Definitely, I just want to say a word for the energy companies. I think what Brenda has said, just to build up, we need a stable ecosystem, which means that we need to have counterparts which are reassured in their future, and we need to have somebody to sell our crude oil and gas. With all what's going on with these hyperinflated prices, it doesn't happen.
Okay.
So, of course, we are maybe short-term benefiting from high oil prices, but long-term, all the energy companies I know, they all are for the more solid and strong market, and for the right ecosystem where everybody gets a share of the pie. And I think the world is coming to it. It just needs, with all the geopolitical risk, with all what's going on, of course, it will take time.
Okay.
But it has nothing to do with an energy companies.
And Karim, you get the final word.
Sure. Just want to emphasize something my colleagues here said, that the energy landscape is changing. It's getting electrified. The renewables are now cheaper than many traditional fossil fuel-based energy sources, but only new facilities. Existing facilities will stay there, and they will certainly serve the base load until we figure out a way in which we can stabilize this renewable energy. We could do that by batteries, which are still too expensive, or by hydrogen, which is still too expensive, green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, as a storage medium. So far, both of those technologies are still not quite there, so we're still having to use a crutch in terms of the base load. But in the long term, I think we will expect to see renewables taking over ultimately, and the IEA is telling us that we will need to peak our new fossil fuel capacity pretty soon, and no new capacity apparently according to the IEA in terms of gas, in terms of oil, and in terms of coal. When the shape of that curve is yet to be determined, but that's the ultimate endpoint that we're aiming at. There will still be some fossil fuels even by 2050, that we expect that, but the long-term trends has already been set. I don't think anyone expects the current energy landscape to remain. There are many challenges along the way, including, of course, the sourcing of those materials. At the current moment, they're dependent on one country ultimately, which is China, in terms of processing most of these metals and sourcing them. So the world is changing, and it's really exciting. Hopefully it will change fast enough if we are to avoid the worst of climate change.
All right. Thank you to my guests, Karim Elgendi, Zaur Garamananov, and Brenda Schaefer. And thank you to all of you who stayed on your Friday evening.